Continuing in Plato's Symposium, we must now deal with Alcibiades' speech in praise of Socrates. I probably referred to this in earlier videos in the series as a speech in praise of love by Alcibiades that was coming up. Well, it is, because Socrates is the paradigmatic lover. Now, we're still using the Hackett edition, the complete works of Plato here. And I think it's probably best if I at least try to only hit a few highlights of this speech and then wrap it up. The speech of Alcibiades in praise of Socrates is a little long, but I think maybe we'll read his paragraph at the beginning. "Nothing can stop me now," said Alcibiades, "but here's what you can do. If I say anything that's not true, you can just interrupt if you want and correct me. At worst, there will be mistakes in my speech, not lies, but you can't hold it against me if I don't get everything in the right order. I'll say things as they come to mind. It is no easy task for one in my condition, because Alcibiades is super-duper drunk, to give a smooth and orderly account of your bizarreness." According to my marginalia, I've looked up the vocabulary word there, and the word for bizarreness is atopos, out of placeness, or being out of place, or not having a place. Alcibiades doesn't understand the place of Socrates. And place is actually a huge, interesting topic in philosophy. I don't know that I've ever noticed it in Aristotle or Aquinas. Maybe that's just because I'm not smart enough, but I've noticed it in Plato and Leibniz and Augustine. And I don't know if I'm smart enough to have noticed it by myself, but Karl Vaught was a great philosophy teacher, an Augustine scholar, and he taught me a little bit about noticing this sort of thing. Anyway, we have no time to talk about place now. He says he'll try to praise Socrates, etc., etc., and he accuses Socrates of being impudent, contemptuous, and vile. Strange things to say in a speech in praise of Socrates. Socrates is impudent, contemptuous, and vile. And he says Socrates... hang on, I don't want to botch an analogy he's using. Okay, I may just have to read some of this. He says to Socrates, "You're much more marvelous than Marsyas, who needed instruments to cast his spells on people. And so does anyone who plays his tunes today, for even the tunes Olympus played are Marsyas' work, since Olympus learned everything from him." Let's not go into the Greek backstory and who is Marsyas and who is Olympus. Never mind. These are characters from Greek culture, Greek stories. Whether they are played by the greatest flautist, or the meanest flute girl, the lowliest flute girl, his melodies have in themselves the power to possess and so reveal those people who are ready for the god and his mysteries. So he's talking about... Oh, it's the satyr. Satyr, Marsyas. I should have gone a little more slowly. Socrates is like the satyr Marsyas. And if you happen to have the Hackett edition, the footnotes are of interest. Okay, so satyr, the Satyr, Marsyas, played these amazing flute melodies that would possess people, and so reveal those who are ready for the god and his mysteries. Now, there's so much interesting language here. Socrates had Diotima talking about being ready for the mysteries, the secret rites or rituals of love, and something about divine beauty. It may be that Alcibiades here is giving his own imperfect, maybe I should just say botching of this. He's describing something like this, but getting it largely wrong. Anyway, he says Socrates is like Marsyas, because Marsyas could play these bewitching melodies. He says the melodies are themselves divine. The difference, though, between Socrates and Marsyas, the satyr who could play these magic melodies, is the difference between you and Marsyas is that you need no instruments. Marsyas still needed a flute to play his melodies. Socrates doesn't even need an instrument. Socrates' words were powerful. They upset Alcibiades. Alcibiades, under the influence of Socrates' words, he's now gone back several years, presumably, to the early stages of his story with Socrates. Socrates' words had upset him so deeply that my very own soul started protesting that my life was no better than the most miserable slaves. Alcibiades thinks, I'm the man. I'm super cool. I'm rich and handsome and powerful, and I have a great future. Alcibiades is vain, and Socrates made him think that his life was no better than the life of the most miserable slave. Alcibiades was not happy with this feeling, but this is the sort of thing that happens. Socrates asks you to pay attention to what you're doing with your life and what's the point of life anyway. And do you really think that you're supposed to be spending your life in pursuit of money, power, fame, physical pleasures, the things people do pursue with their lives? Socrates wants us to consider whether there's actually any value in these things, whether these are actually the point of life. And Alcibiades, bewitched by the words of Socrates, started thinking, oh crap, maybe there's not. Maybe my life is pointless and worthless. Maybe Socrates' questions are right and I have no answer available for them. Socrates is the only man in the world who has made me feel shame, says Alcibiades, because he knew Socrates was right. And he says when he left the side of Socrates, he would go back to his old ways. He would cave into his desire to please the crowd. Alcibiades is corrupted by the crowd. He's interested in fame. He'll sell out for applause. My whole life has become one constant effort to escape from him and to keep away, but when I see him I feel deeply ashamed because I'm doing nothing about my way of life, though I've already agreed with him that I should. I can't live with him and I can't live without him. What can I do about him? Well, obviously what he could do is he could just start doing what Socrates advises, and he could start caring more about virtue than about pleasing the crowd. But Alcibiades is not wise enough to make this decision. So he lives in this weird state of tension, at least until he surrenders to the wrong side of things and doesn't have any more Socrates in him. Maybe that's where things are going. All right. He says, I'm going to show you what Socrates is really like. And he says, to begin with, he's crazy about beautiful boys. He constantly follows them around in a perpetual daze. Alcibiades no doubt interprets this gaily. Alcibiades no doubt thinks that Socrates follows around beautiful boys because Socrates is super gay. But keep in mind not only the Pausanias speech, but also the speech of Socrates recounting the words of Diotima. Socrates might have just been following around promising young men whom he thought maybe he could educate a little bit. Maybe he could teach to rethink their lives and pursue virtue rather than money, power, fame, physical pleasures. And after saying that Socrates is crazy about beautiful boys, he ends up saying, you can't imagine how little he cares whether a person is beautiful or rich or famous in any other way that most people admire. He considers all those possessions beneath contempt, and that's how he considers all of us as well. So Socrates actually doesn't care about physical attractiveness. And I really need to streamline this. And maybe I can streamline it after I just read a few bits. What I thought at the time, says Alcibiades, was that what he really wanted was me. Alcibiades thought that Socrates wanted him. And that seemed to me the luckiest coincidence. All I had to do was let him have his way with me, and he would teach me everything he knew. I don't know whether to read that sexually or purely platonically with respect to teaching and education, or more likely both. Alcibiades, I think, is much more like Pausanias in his expectations for how older man, younger man mental relationships should go. Believe me, I had a lot of confidence in my looks. Naturally, up to that time, we'd never been alone. One of my attendants had always been present, but with this in mind, I sent the attendant away and met Socrates alone. You see, in this company, I must tell the whole truth. So pay attention. And Socrates, if I say anything untrue, I want you to correct me. For the record, I don't think Socrates ever corrects Alcibiades on the details of the story anyway. So there I was, my friends, alone with him at last. My idea, naturally, was that he'd take advantage of the opportunity to tell me whatever it is that lovers say when they find themselves alone. I relished the moment, but no such luck. Nothing of the sort occurred. Socrates had his usual sort of conversation with me, and at the end of the day, he went off. Socrates isn't hiding something. He's interested in the things he says he's interested in. He's not going to have a secret conversation. And now Alcibiades begins to pursue Socrates. and he keeps trying to get alone with Socrates, and um, there's more overt sexuality. All right, so Alcibiades had invited Socrates to dinner one time, and it kept him talking late into the night. All the servants have gone to bed, and the lights are out, and in the dark, alone with Socrates, Alcibiades tries to have some frank conversation about their relationship, and really, I don't know how to read this other than to say Alcibiades has been thoroughly corrupted by the Athenian culture. I don't know how else to read this, at least not today. Maybe another day I could think of something else. It looks to me like the story is telling us Alcibiades was thoroughly corrupted by Athenian culture, and what Socrates wanted, what he had earlier learned from Diotima, was merely to educate this young man. But what Alcibiades thinks is, to get the education, he's supposed to be giving Socrates sexual favors, and he needs to seal the deal with the sexual encounter tonight. I think that's what he actually thought he needed to do. And so he has to try this frank conversation about Socrates as his lover, and Socrates... he says he thinks Socrates can make him a better man. Socrates can train him in virtue, and Socrates has his doubts about himself. Maybe I'm not so wise, etc. And Alcibiades, I don't want to read all these paragraphs. I don't even have time. You should read the book for yourself. Alcibiades thinks that his words had finally hit their mark. That Socrates was smitten by my arrows, he says. I didn't give him a chance to say another word. I stood up immediately and placed my mantle over the light cloak, which, though it was the middle of winter, was his only clothing. I slipped underneath the cloak and put my arms around this man, this utterly unnatural, this truly extraordinary man, and spent the whole night next to him. Socrates, you can't deny a word of it, and as I recall, Socrates never does. But in spite of all my efforts, this hopelessly arrogant, this unbelievably insolent man, he turned me down. He spurned my beauty, of which I was so proud. And he says his night with Socrates went no further than if I had spent it with my own father or older brother. He wanted Socrates to have sexual encounter with him, and Socrates wasn't interested, despite the fact that they're under the same cloak. I mean, basically, they're naked together for the remainder of the night. And he goes on to describe some other extraordinary aspects of Socrates. And I'll skim over them. He says, this man here is so bizarre, his ways and ideas are so unusual that search as you might, you'll never find anyone else, alive or dead, who's even remotely like him. The best you can do is not to compare him to anything human, but to liken him as I do to Silenus and the satyrs, and the same goes for his ideas and arguments. And he suggests that Socrates' ideas are truly worthy of a god, bursting with figures of virtue inside. I'm not going to pause and explain the analogy he's drawing to the statues of Silenus, whom he started off by talking about, another character from Greek legend, story, culture, myth. They're of the greatest importance for anyone who wants to become a truly good man. What Socrates teaches is of the greatest importance for anyone who wants to become a truly virtuous human being. So he's seriously praising Socrates now, even though he said Socrates is bizarre and impudent. But one gets the impression that Socrates spurning Alcibiades sexually was the only thing that upsets him about Socrates, and one gets the impression that all Socrates ever wanted was not the sexual stuff that Pausanias and Alcibiades would have approved of. What Socrates wanted was just to teach this guy virtue, and he was barely even interested. Things would have gone better if he had never tried to have a special mentor relationship with Socrates, and he had just listened to Socrates and reordered his life around the idea that virtue is more important than the praises of the crowd. Well, this is my praise of Socrates, says Alcibiades, though I haven't spared him my reproach either. Quite true. I told you how horribly he treated me. And not only me, but also Charmides, Euthydemus, and many others. He has deceived us all. He presents himself as your lover. And before you know it, you're in love with him yourself. I warn you, Agathon, don't let him fool you. Remember our torments. Be on your guard. Don't wait like the fool in the proverb to learn your lesson from your own misfortune. Learn from our experience so you don't have to learn from your own. He says to Agathon. Now he thinks Agathon is Socrates' next victim, so to speak. And yet what sort of a victim? Socrates, to Alcibiades and also other characters, Charmides, Euthydemus, not speaking characters in this story, Socrates has presented himself to other promising young men as their lover, in accordance with something like the mentor relationships Pausanias described, but Socrates wasn't ever in it, apparently, for the for that aspect, for the sexual aspect of the relationship. He was in it only for education and virtue. And this seems to have left Alcibiades confused and upset. And that's all. I think we need a separate video to wrap up the last page and a quarter of the Symposium. If you've actually watched all this, good heavens, thanks for watching, and see you next time.